Wartime London was a mecca for both servicemen of all Allied nations and for prostitutes from across Britain. There was a high demand and a high supply, and there was money to be made. Prostitution is always a dangerous business for those who take part in it, but many did so, soliciting on the streets of central London for passing trade. We have already seen that such situations can end horribly. This story is little known because the murders occurred during a world war, so press coverage was limited because paper was rationed, and newspapers were smaller, and also matters to do with the war would normally be given greater coverage, resulting in other events being dealt with far more concisely. The killings took place over a very short time, and thankfully were also dealt with very quickly. There were no loose ends, as with Jack the Ripper. There has been only one book devoted to the topic, and although there never has been any explicit dramatization of it, an episode of Foyle's War appears to have been based upon it, as well as it being the basis for a novel. The first murder did not portend the full horrors to come, however. On Monday morning, the 9th of February 1942, the dead body of a woman was found in a brick-built air raid shelter at the side of Montague Place, Marylebone, close to Gloucester Place. Harold Batchelor, a plumber, and William Baldwin, his assistant, saw a torch lying in the gutter nearby, and on investigating saw a woman's leg protruding from the shelter. They then telephoned the police, and at 8:51 a.m., a police car arrived with PC John Miles inside. His statement read, "We saw apparently the dead body of a woman lying on her back with her legs drawn up. Her head was inclined to the left and the lower part of her face covered with a scarf, her right breast bare, and her clothing was disarrayed. Lying at her feet were her powder box and a box of matches. In the entrance of the opposite shelter there was a black torch. In between the shelter was a woman's hat." PC Miles went to inform his colleagues at Marylebone Police Station and later returned to the scene. At 10:15 a.m. he found, lying on the pavement on Wyndham Place, a woman's black handbag which had been rifled and torn apart. This suggested that the killer went westwards after the murder, as Wyndham Place leads off from the west of Montague Place, so perhaps he lived to the west or northwest of where the murder occurred. 1. The woman had been strangled. She had been gagged over the mouth and nose by her own silk scarf. There was no sign of a struggle and no one heard anything. Possibly she was killed elsewhere and then dumped there from a car, but no one had seen or heard one. Detective Inspector Clare led the investigation. There was a sexual dimension to the case too, which was not reported in the press. Not only had the victim's right breast been exposed, but her skirt had been pulled up and her underwear was pulled down. There were also blood smears on her underclothes. However, she was a virgin and had not been raped, but the way the clothing had been pulled about suggests that a sexual pervert was responsible. Her wristwatch had stopped at 1 a.m., and the police assumed this was the time of her murder. Superintendent Frederick Cherrill, 1892-1964, the well-known fingerprint expert, examined the body. He found marks on the woman's throat. Unfortunately, there was no trace of the killer's fingerprints, though Cherrill thought he was probably left-handed. These marks were only bruises, nor did the handbag and its contents yield any fingerprints except those of the victim. Initially, the woman's identity was unknown, and so the police advertised a description of her. Age 35, height 5 feet 3 in, medium build, dark brown hair, good teeth, stopped filling in right up jaw, hazel eyes, oval face, straight thin nose, heavy eyebrows, right middle finger near nail deformed, possibly result of crushing. She wore a single-breasted raglan-style overcoat of biscuit color mixture green woolen hat, 2 pairs of light-colored cotton mixture stockings, imitation brown crocodile skin shoes, size 6 1/2 brown velvet coatee, brown woolen mixture skirt with jacket to match having a 3-button front, green wool jumper, white vest, and silk stockinette slip, knitted red and green mixture scarf, and brown kid gloves. As it turned out, the woman was identified by her teeth, which had been worked on by a Newcastle dentist. The victim was Miss Evelyn Margaret Hamilton, who had been born in Newcastle on the 8th of April, 1901, the second child of a draper's salesman, and who, by 1939, lived at 6 Iveston Road, Durham, being employed as a retail chemist. She had been a student at Sunderland Technical College and then studied chemistry at Edinburgh University, graduating on the 3rd of October 1928, before working for a Messrs. A. Wilson, a chemist at Brighton, for 12 years. As someone who knew her at college stated, she was every well-mannered and charming, the sort of person you remember years after you have met them. On the other hand, a junior colleague claimed she was very unsociable and grumbling and did not speak to me except to give orders. She was very eccentric. Evelyn had no interest in men but was an intellectual and a fervent socialist. At the time of her death, she was living and working in Hornchurch, Essex. On death, she had £209, 1s 6 left to her widowed mother. Pointedly, perhaps, Detective Chief Inspector Greenough significantly stated that she was a respectable woman, as did Cheryl. Evelyn's job at the chemist in Hornchurch, which began on the 1st of December, 1941, paid her £5 per week, but it came to an end after 2 months, and casting around she found another position in Grimsby. On Sunday the 8th of February she left the Essex town for Grimsby via London, sending her luggage on ahead. She took the train to London and at 10 p.m. was at Baker Street Station. She then took a cab to 26 Gloucester Place, only a few minutes' walk away, but found that there were no spare rooms there. She then went to the 3 Arts Club at 76 Gloucester Place and, arriving at 11 p.m., found a room there. There was no food there, so she went out on foot in search of supper. It seems that she went to Maison Lyon, Marble Arch, and was eating there at about midnight. The supper she had apparently included beetroot. Presumably she walked southwards and then after eating walked northwards and either took a wrong turn along Montague Place, where she was found, or was inveigled down there, as 76 Gloucester Place is just after the junction with Montague Place. It was thought that robbery was the motive for Evelyn's murder because her handbag had been rifled for its contents. It still contained her identity card, her ration book, her cigarette lighter, a nail file, a cigarette case, a powder compact, and a black fountain pen. There was no one who was known to have had any animosity towards her personally, so presumably her attacker did not know her prior to the murder. There was very little clue to his identity at all, and so the crime might be virtually impossible to solve. Unfortunately, this was not to be a one-off murder. The next woman to be killed was Mrs. Evelyn Oatley. She had been born as Evelyn Judd in Airby, Yorkshire, on the 5th of April 1908, and had an elder brother, Herman. In 1911, they were living with the Tiernan family in a little house in Keighley, West Yorkshire. When she grew older, she worked in a textile mill, of which there were many in the district. The family lived in the High Street and then in Grafton Road. In 1934, she moved to Blackpool, and on the 25th of June 1936, married Harold Mollinson Oatley, 4 years her senior, at Field Registry Office. They had met in 1932. They did not have any children. Before meeting Oatley, Evelyn had an illegitimate child who was adopted and went to Canada. In 1939, the two were resident at 182 Ravensmead River Road, Thornton, in Lancashire. Oatley was a poultry farmer and Evelyn was a housewife. Evelyn probably found life as a farmer's wife in rural Lancashire tedious. She had lived and worked in London prior to her marriage and returned there in April 1938. as she rented a bedsit on the first-floor front at 153 Wardour Street in Soho, London, for 22s6 days per week, later falling to £1. There she was known as Nina and Lita Ward. It was claimed in the press that she was employed at the Windmill Theatre, but there is no evidence of this. Rather, it seemed that she earned her living by prostitution, though she was never convicted of soliciting. She often returned to her husband during the summers, but he last saw her on a trip to London, and she saw him off at Euston Railway Station on the 3rd of February, 1942. Though remaining on relatively friendly terms with her, apparently he had recently seen a solicitor seeking a divorce as she wanted to remarry. He said his wife was fascinated with West End life and would not leave it. Evelyn was seen alive outside the Monaco restaurant Piccadilly at 11 p.m. on Monday the 9th of February. Shortly afterwards, her neighbor, Ivy Poole, who lived in the room opposite, recalled her coming up the stairs with a man. The couple entered Evelyn's room, and Ivy returned to her room and put the wireless on. It is probable she left the flat again that night. At 8:25 next morning, Charles Fueling, employed by an electricity company, visited the house to read the meter and to collect the money due. He called at Ivy's flat and then at Evelyn's. He received no answer to his knock at the latter's door, so he tried it and found it was 6 inches ajar. He called Ivy and she entered the room and called out, "Are you there, dear?" turned on the light, and then saw Evelyn's naked body lying motionless on the bed. She said, "Oh dear, she looks dead." Fueling left the building and ran to find a policeman. Fueling found Inspector John Hennessy and said, "I am glad I found an officer." Hennessy accompanied him to the room and later in his report wrote of what he saw. "I flashed my torch and saw a woman, believed to be Evelyn Oatley, aged about 26, on her back on a divan or single bed in a transverse position. Her head was pointing north and was hanging over down the side of the bed. She was naked except for a slender garment which covered her breasts. I saw that her throat had been cut and a hand torch was wedged in her private parts. A tin opener was lying near the torch and her legs were wide apart. There was a pillow on the floor beneath her head, and a razor blade was a foot from one of her hands." Ivy told the policeman about seeing Evelyn with a man last night and added, "I am a light sleeper, but I did not hear any disturbance during the night." As Hennessy did not have any colleagues with him, he asked Fueling, whom he knew by sight, to go to nearby Trenchard House to bring additional officers, including the police surgeon and divisional detective inspector, while he prevented any public access to the room. Among those arriving was Superintendent Cheryl, who later wrote she was a ghastly sight. She had been the victim of a sadistic attack of the most horrible and revolting kind. However, there was little disorder elsewhere in the room. Near the bed were interesting finds. One was a blood-stained tin opener. Another was a pair of curling tongs. By the couch was her handbag, which had been emptied out. In this was a piece of mirror. Examining it, Cheryl found a thumbprint. It had not been made by the owner. The tin opener, presumably the murder weapon, also bore the trace of a fingerprint. Both were left-handed. Unfortunately, they did not match anyone with a criminal record whose fingerprints were on file. The investigation was not advancing very much. The police needed to catch the killer before they could ascertain his identity, and this was very much a chicken and egg situation. Evelyn had been killed on the night of Monday-Tuesday, 9/10 February, by a man wielding a razor blade and then mutilated by a tin opener. The wounds had also been probed by curling tongs, which were now blood-stained. As with Evelyn Hamilton, in addition to the murderer being a person of sadistic tendencies, he is also a thief. Evelyn was believed by those who knew her to carry 50 pounds, 80 on her person, and needless to say, this was never found, though she left just over 470 pounds to her husband. Gladys Langford, 1890–1972, a London teacher, noted in her diary, 2 murders of women committed in the West End in 24 hours. I suspect a sex maniac may be responsible for both. There were apparently no murders on the next 2 nights after 2 consecutive nights of murder, but 2 other women were accosted by the killer on the night of Thursday, the 12th of February. Mrs. Margaret Mary Haywood, a married woman living apart from her husband, was waiting to meet an army officer at the Brasserie Universelle. He was late, and while waiting, she was accosted by a man in an RAF uniform. They went for a drink at the Trocadero. He said, "I am not broke. I will just show you something," and showed her about 20 pounds, 30, but she rejected his suggestions, though she did give him her telephone number, written down on a piece of paper. However, on leaving at 8:45, he said, "I want to kiss you goodnight. Aren't there any air raid shelters round here?" She replied, "I don't know of any, and in any case, I wouldn't go in one with you." They walked along Windmill Street and Jermyn Street. It was on St. Albans Street near the Punch Bowl pub that he attacked her, kissing her and trying to pull her skirt up, and as she resisted, he put his hands up to her head as if he intended to kiss her, but instead he gripped her by the throat so tightly that she lost consciousness. Fortunately, a passer-by, 18-year-old John Shine, noticed what was happening, and on shining his torch and making as if to intervene, Margaret's assailant fled. It was about 9:45 p.m. The man left behind his gas mask, and his would-be victim reported this to the police. Shortly after this, Margaret Haywood's attacker found, on nearby Regent Street, another woman, Mrs. Catherine Mulcahy, alias Kathleen King, a 22-year-old prostitute. They went back to her flat at 29 Southwark Street near Sussex Gardens, Paddington. They traveled by taxi. On entering the flat, the light failed. The man wanted to spend a lot of time with her, and despite earlier boasting of how much money he had, Catherine wanted to transact their business quickly so as to find another client. This attitude annoyed him, and he wanted to take his time with her. He then tried to strangle Catherine. She fought back, freed herself from his grip, and screamed. She rushed into the corridor clad only in her boots, and Agnes Morris, a neighbor, recalled that she said, "Let me in. This man is trying to strangle me. Look at the marks on my neck. Fetch the police." There were indeed red marks on her neck. Fearful of exposure, the man left, giving her 10 one-pound notes. It was about 11 p.m. The police issued a description of a man they wanted to question. It read as follows: age 25, 26, height 5'8", fresh complexion, hair chestnut or medium brown, wavy in front, frizzy on the crown, brown eyes, small mouth and thin lips, clean shaven, protruding chin, dressed in electric blue overcoat with fine gray line and square check. Just as the panic was at its height, the killer was arrested at 5:45 a.m. on Friday the 13th of February at St. James Close because the respirator with its owner's RAF number 525987 had been left in the wake of the attack on Margaret Haywood. This made the owner very easy to trace, and once he was, one of his living victims was able to pick him out of an identity parade. The other could only state he was an RAF man. The man identified was Frederick Gordon Cummins, an RAF cadet pilot stationed in Regent's Park. However, Cummins was more than a possible double murderer and double assailant. On the day of his arrest, the police made 2 further shocking discoveries. The first concerned Mrs. Margaret Florence Campbell Lowe, born as Margaret Burchett in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, in about 1899, the oldest of the women to be killed and the only one with a child. By 1919, she had crossed the world and was working as a prostitute in London, where she received her first of 3 fines for soliciting. The second came in 1920. She left that business soon afterwards when she married Frederick George Lowe, a hairdresser, at Rochford Registry Office in Essex on the 11th of October 1921. They had a child, Barbara, born in about 1925. Margaret assisted her husband in his business in Southend. He died on the 14th of December 1932 in Southend. The two ran a boarding house at 21 Alexandra Street, Southend in 1932-33. By October 1933, they had dispensed with this, and Margaret moved to London, Barbara remaining in Essex to attend St. Gabriel's School, York Road, in Southend. She would visit her mother every third weekend. Margaret lived at several addresses in London and, reverting to prostitution, acquired another fine for soliciting in 1938. On the 27th of October 1941, she lived at a flat at 9/10 Gosfield Street, paying a weekly rent of 25s. She had £215 3s to her name. She frequented Charing Cross Road, Oxford Street, and Piccadilly. According to other women, she was known as the Lady and the Pearl, because she was well-spoken and did not associate with other prostitutes. Apparently she was handsome and well-built. She also went by the name Peggy Campbell. However, once clients were back at her flat, neighbors could sometimes hear arguments and the sounds of violence between them. In the previous week, the police had called at her flat because she alleged that a Canadian soldier had attacked her. Her neighbor, a Mrs. Bartolini, recalled hearing Mrs. Lowe enter her room with a guest on Wednesday the 11th of February and heard the guest leaving in the early hours of the next morning. Mrs. Lowe was last seen on the streets on Wednesday the 11th of February at 12:30 a.m. She was near the Regent Palace Hotel on Piccadilly. Neighbors then heard her return at about 1:30 a.m. with a man. The latter was later heard noisily leaving at an unstated time. Maurice Wiseman, a neighbor and a tailor, noticed 2 days later that there was a parcel outside Lowe's door that had not been collected. He began to be suspicious and so called the police. He was not the only one to be concerned. A telephone call from Barbara, Lowe's 15-year-old daughter who had returned from evacuation, resulted in the police arriving at 4:30 p.m. on Friday the 13th of February. D.S. Leonard Blacktop had been given a duplicate key to the outer door of the flats, but he found that the front door to Margaret's flat was locked. He found a key under the mat and then entered the room. He first noted the room was a bed sitting room and in perfect order. He went along the inside passage, all blacked out, and entered the kitchenette, the door of which was open. He went to the door of the middle room, which was locked. Knocking resulted in no response, and, unable to find a key, Blacktop had to force it open. The room was in darkness, so he turned on the light. He then saw a bed. In the room, and on the bed, was a body. The detective recorded. The bedclothes covered the body up to the neck, and a pillow was covering most of her face. I removed the pillow and saw the woman's face and neck. I saw a tight ligature around the front and a frothy substance round the nose and mouth. The head was turned to the left, and the face was cold. I concluded the woman was dead. He sent for a police surgeon and a senior officer. As with Evelyn Oatley, what detectives saw was shocking. It was a scantily furnished room with a single bed, chair, table, rug, and carpet. On the black eiderdown at the foot of the bed were the woman's coat, skirt, and jumper, clearly thrown aside by the owner. A hat was also nearby. The room had been ransacked. Cheryl wrote, but it was not these things which attracted my eye so much as the various mutilations which had been wreaked upon the dead woman and which were even more shocking than those inflicted upon Mrs. Oatley. Cheryl did not state what was so terrible to his readers in 1954, but the police files relate that the killer had carried out a similar atrocity to what he had done to Evelyn. A candle had been inserted into her vagina. There was a 5-inch cut across her stomach and a 10-inch wound on her right groin, presumably inflicted after strangulation. On the mantelpiece was a glass of beer and a candlestick, from which a candle had been torn. There were fingerprints on its base. There was also a bottle of stout in the kitchen, the contents of which had been poured into the glass. Again, there were fingerprints on the bottle. These were important clues. The prints on the candlestick were those of a right-handed person, which led Cheryl to deduce that he was left-handed and had been grasping for the candle. Comparing the fingerprints taken at the previous crime scene, he found that they were of different fingers, but he deduced that the motive in all 3 murders was the same, and so it was one killer they were pursuing. There were bloodstains on the blankets, and these were removed the next day to the police laboratory at Hendon. 4 bloody knives and a poker were also found. Detective Chief Inspector Greeno was the investigating officer, and he was pleasantly surprised that the corpse had not been touched prior to his arrival. With him was the famous pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury. He said to Greeno, "Have you seen the others?" To which the detective said no, he had only read about them. "I have," said the pathologist quietly. "Are you thinking the same as I am?" said Greeno. A dispatch rider stopped outside and brought in a message for Greeno, who thought that Spilsbury could probably guess the contents already. "Not another one?" asked Spilsbury. Returning the message to the envelope, Greeno said, "Yes, another one. Sussex Gardens. Coming?" They were then driven to a 2-roomed ground-floor flat at 187 Sussex Gardens, where they found the body of Mrs. Doris Joannet, stabbed and strangled. The body was still warm, and Greeno shuddered at the sight. Spilsbury said, "You've got a madman on parade here. When you catch him, I would like to know if he's left-handed." Doris Elizabeth Joannet had been born Doris Robson on the 21st of March, 1909. As with Evelyn Hamilton, she was from the northeast of England, the Leamington district of Newcastle upon Tyne. Likewise, along with Evelyn Hamilton and Margaret Lowe, she had gravitated at a young age to London and fell into prostitution. However, she did not walk the streets for trade like the others, or so she told her future husband. Rather, she entertained her men friends for money at her flat at 240 Edgware Road. It was in this way that she met the man she was to marry. They met in Oxford Street, which belies her previous comment. Doris had married Henri Alfred Joannet, naturalized as a British subject in about 1905, and a retired hotelier 34 years her senior, at Paddington Registry Office on the 4th of November, 1935. Her husband described her thus: "My wife was 5 feet 10 inches tall, very slim with fair hair and blue eyes. She was of a very happy disposition." Initially, they lived in a flat in Sussex Gardens and did not work, as he had a private income from the profits of selling the business he owned, which provided them with an income of £10 per week. In 1937, they moved to Bournemouth and ran a cafe there that they bought. In the following year, they lived in Grays Road, Eastbourne, and in 1940 lived with Doris's mother in Harrogate. They returned to London in May 1941. It was at this time that the pair began to diverge, possibly because of the age difference. She wished to return to her former profession, and they had rows. Eventually, he agreed to give her a weekly allowance of £2.10 and a room in Sussex Gardens. In the autumn of that year, he ran hotels in Haywards Heath and then in Farnborough, before returning to London on the 1st of February, 1942. He was now the manager of the Royal Court Hotel, Sloane Square, and they rented a flat at 187 Sussex Gardens. Unlike the desperate women of 1888 who fell to the Ripper's knife, Doris did not need to be a prostitute. She had a home, a husband, and a reasonable income. She chose her lifestyle and the risks it entailed, perhaps because she liked the excitement, the power, and the money it gave her. She claimed she knew lots of very nice class people and had many of what she called men friends. She was paid handsomely to whip some of them. She did not go into pubs and called herself Olga. Henri ran a hotel but also owned the flat, and he had been sleeping at the hotel while his wife used the flat. On the night of the tragedy, Thursday the 12th of February, they had had supper together at the flat, and they then walked to Paddington Station. Henri explained, "She wished me good night very sweetly, and her last words to me were, 'Don't be late tomorrow, darling.' It was about 9:30, and he got an underground train to go to work, after advising his wife to go straight home." Meanwhile, Doris did not return to the flat. She went out soliciting on Sussex Gardens and the Edgware Road. She took at least one client back to the flat and then returned to look for another. A woman recalled that her last words to her at about 10:30 p.m. were, "I am going to try and get off before I go home." Her husband, who was very distraught, later related that on the next day, Friday the 13th of February, "I returned to the flat at 7 o'clock on Friday night and was surprised to see that the milk had not been taken in. When I got into the flat, I shouted out Doris, but there was no reply. On going into the sitting room, I found that the supper things from the night before were still on the table, and the curtains had not been drawn. I was worried, and when I found the bedroom door had been locked, I knew something was amiss. I could not get any reply, so I went to the housekeeper, and we went for the police. P.C. William Payne and P.C. Cox were first to arrive at 7:31 p.m. As the door was locked, Payne had to force it open using his foot. The room was all dark, so he switched on the light and noticed that the electric fire was still on. He saw that the two twin beds were close to one another, and there appeared to be the shape of a body under the bedclothes. I pulled the bedclothes but slightly and revealed the head of a woman. I pulled the bedclothes of the other twin bed and saw the apparently lifeless body of a woman, the same woman, naked except for a dressing gown. A tight-bound stocking was round the neck. A circular cut ran round under the left breast, and the private parts appeared slashed, over which was a pad. He went next door to telephone Marylebone police station. Back at the flat, they found two preventives, contraceptive devices, on the floor, as well as women's clothing. The clock had stopped at 8. There were also blood smears on the sheets of the bed, where the body was not. It was clear that the killer had struck again. There was the body of Mrs. Joannet, clad only in a dressing gown, which had been pulled open and with a tightly knotted scarf around her neck. She was lying across the bed. She had been savagely slashed in the stomach near the vagina, and on the left groin, probably by the razor found in the room. There was no sign of a struggle. The woman's clothing was heaped on a chair at the foot of the bed. There was a clock which Cheryl claimed, contrary to P.C. Payne, had stopped at 4.45. Greeno searched about the flat for clues. There was a great quantity of dust, and it revealed a number of tales to the detective. On the mantelpiece and the dressing table, there were outlines showing items that had been taken recently. Greeno measured these. They might have belonged to a fountain pen and a comb. In the drawer was a broad roll of adhesive tape, out of which someone had cut a narrow strip. Greeno related in his memoirs, not much in the way of clues, but we were starting. He thought that one man was responsible for all the murders. But where to start? Solving a murder is like doing a jigsaw. You have only to fit the pieces together when you find them. That is where patience is needed. The careful plotting, the questioning, the screening, and the sifting. Of course, the killer had already been caught. Possibly Greeno was being forgetful when recording his reminiscences nearly 2 decades later. 2 of the victims were prostitutes, and Doris was a part-timer. Therefore, Greeno needed to look among them, the potential victims for his next lead. He set up his headquarters, as he was now assigned to be in charge of the whole investigation at Tottenham Court Road Police Station. He began a systematic tour of Paddington and Soho, asking prostitutes whether they had been attacked or if they knew anyone who had. As he later wrote, speed was essential because the murderer might strike again at any moment. He had killed on Sunday and Monday, Wednesday and Thursday, but not on Tuesday. Greenough wondered why there had been an interval. Fortunately, evidence began to emerge. A cupboard door close to the bed yielded fingerprints, as did a hand mirror on the dressing table. The bedroom door also showed fingerprints. At least there was a prime suspect already in custody. Greenough saw Cummins at Brixton Prison. He admitted to being at the Trocadero on the 12th of February, having been out with RAF comrades between 6 and 9 p.m. that evening in that vicinity, but not to attacking anyone. As to the gas masks, he said that there had been a mix-up and another man had his and he had the other man's. The physical evidence went against him, however. His wristwatch had a piece of adhesive tape that exactly matched that taken from Doris's drawer. The gas mask with his name on it had traces of grit and cement dust, which matched those in the air raid shelter where Evelyn Hamilton's body had been found. He had a comb and pen that not only matched the dust outlines in Doris's room, but when they were shown to her husband, he recognized them as being hers. There was also a scrap of paper with Margaret Haywood's telephone number on it. Greenough also searched Cummins' billet and found in the bin a green propelling pencil that friends of Evelyn Hamilton identified as hers. He also found there a pair of rubber-soled shoes. Greenough went back to Brixton and saw Cummins again. He asked him, "Why did you throw these away? Was it because you'd read something in the papers about our finding footprints in the snow?" There was no answer. The rubber soles fitted perfectly. Then there were the 2-pound notes that Phyllis Attacker had given her. Checking the issue numbers with those handed out on the recent pay parade, these matched those given to Cummins. However, despite all this evidence, Cummins had an alibi because of his passbook, which had to be signed when he left his billet and when he returned. This seemed to show that he had returned on the nights of the murders well before they had been committed. Likewise, his mates in the barracks remembered him being in bed at relatively early hours. However, the passbook evidence was weak. When a fellow airman returned, he told the corporal in the guardroom to cross Cummins off as well. This was a commonplace ruse at service camps. When Greenough brought it up with an officer, the latter said, "For God's sake, what are you doing? You'll blow the whole place wide open." Greenough replied, "I'm sorry about that, but this is a murder case, and that so-called passbook is just a mass of lies." As to his mates, one man recalled that after lights out, he and Cummins got up and went out via the fire escape. The press was rather behind in its reporting. Such was the relative speed of Cummins' capture. One newspaper posited the following theory: with the murder of 2 more women in the West End, the 4th murder in London in a week, the possibility arises that a killer is at large. All the murders have been discovered in approximately the same area. The latest victims had both been strangled. Another newspaper did so too, after noting the number of murders in the previous week, and that 3 had been by the same man. Reference was made to Jack the Ripper, who was stated as being a medical man, avenging his son's premature death from diseases he had contracted through his association with prostitutes, which was a favored theory at one time, now long discounted by serious researchers and forgotten by others. The newspaper was confident that the killer would soon be found due to the police efforts. After Cummins's arrest, he was associated with 2 previous unsolved murders in London. One was Maple Churchyard in 1941. Miss Churchyard was a 19-year-old clerk and was on her way home from Charing Cross to Tufnell Park on the evening of the 12th of October, 1941. Unfortunately, she never arrived, and the next day her body was found in the semi-derelict 225 Hampstead Road. She had been strangled and most of her clothing had been removed. There had been a scream at about 10 p.m. that night, which might have been her. No one was ever charged with the murder. The other was Edith Humphreys, aged 50, found dead in her home on Gloucester Crescent, Regent's Park, 10 days later, having been stabbed in the head and then strangled. She worked as a cook in an auxiliary fire station. It was thought that robbery might be the motive as jewelry was missing, but many of her valuables had not been taken. However, Cummins was never charged with either murder, though subsequent writers have always included these in his tally. What the police really thought has not been looked into. As to the churchyard murder, he could well have been responsible, but they were even less certain about the second. But in both, it cannot go beyond the stage of assumption. The local police found that Mrs. Humphreys's killer had entered her ground floor bedroom by means of an unfastened window, killing her while she was in bed, and this in no ways matches Cummins' modus operandi. Maple was a promiscuous young woman, and possibly Cummins might have persuaded her to go to the ruined building for sex, and might have robbed her of the little she had. But so might any other apparently personable young man. On the 17th of February, Cummins appeared at Bow Street Magistrate Court before Mr. McKenna. An hour before the hearing was to begin, there was a long queue outside the court, and when the doors were opened, the public gallery was soon full. Cummins walked in front of two prison officers. Greeno told McKenna that only formal proof of identity would be offered at the hearing. The public were afforded a look at Cummins, whose brown hair was brushed back, and he wore an RAF overcoat. He sat with his hands clasped in his lap during the 5-minute hearing. He was remanded until 20 February. McKenna asked if he had anything to say, and he just replied, "No, sir." He stood up in the dock and bowed. At Bow Street Magistrates Court on the 26th of March, Cummins was committed for trial at the Old Bailey for the murder of Miss Hamilton. Cummins claimed he had alibis for the nights of the murders. He said that on Sunday the 8th of February, he had visited his wife in their flat in Barnes. As he was broke, she let him have £1 so he could drink with his colleagues. He was at a pub near Baker Street at 9:15 p.m. that night and returned to his billet between 10 and 11 as attested by a colleague. Yet he could easily have left by the fire escape when the others were asleep, and he could easily have engaged Evelyn Hamilton in conversation as he had a knowledge of chemistry and Newcastle upon Tyne. Finally, despite his being broke, on the next day he had £19, which could have been the result of robbing her. He claimed that an unnamed officer repaid a debt. Likewise, on the night of Evelyn Oatley's death, he had been out, drinking with an RAF comrade, Aircraftsman Johnson, in Soho. At about 11 p.m., the two men picked up two prostitutes, Molly Alvin and Laura Denmark. Cummins went with the latter to her flat in 47 Frith Street and left at about midnight. He claimed he later met Johnson and they returned to their billet together, but Johnson said that this was not so. Cummins alleged that he had been drunk on the nights of the murders and that he had spent time with other women. On one instance, on the 12th of February, Mrs. Doreen Litton recalled meeting him at 2 a.m. in Piccadilly, and the two went to her flat at 22 Polygon Mews. Although he gave her £3 notes, there was no sex, only conversation, and he left her unharmed at 3:45 a.m. She recalled that he seemed rather drunk. Neither of these accounts were helpful to his cause, as the first finished before he could have killed Evelyn Oatley, and the second took place after the murder of Doris. The evidence against Cummins was strong. At Bow Street Magistrates Court, his fingerprints had been taken as a matter of course. On comparing these to the tin opener found in Evelyn Oatley's room, the little left finger mark was there. On the mirror in her room was the print of his left thumb. The fingerprint on the base of the candlestick in Mrs. Lowe's room had indeed been made by Cummins' right hand, as were those on the tumbler and the bottle. The trial at the Old Bailey began on the 23rd of April. Justice Asquith oversaw it. Mr. G.B. McClure led for the prosecution. Cummins was charged with the 4 murders and 2 attempted murders, but the focus was on the murder of Evelyn Oatley because the evidence there was strongest. His prime evidence was Cummins's fingerprints on the tin opener and mirror in Evelyn Oatley's room. Spilsbury gave evidence of strangulation. On the 24th of April, the wrong document was shown to the jury, and fearing they might be prejudiced because of it, Asquith dismissed the jury and impaneled a new one to recommence the trial on Monday the 27th of April. Apparently Cheryl had shown enlarged photographs of the fingerprints found at the murder scene and those of Cummins in order to see the similarities. Then, to his horror, Cheryl realized that he was showing the photographs of the Lowe crime scene, not Oatley's. He realized that there was an error and told the judge he had shown the wrong exhibits. So after legal discussions, the trial was stopped and the jury was dismissed. Christmas Humphreys, son of the junior prosecuting counsel in the Brides, in the Bath case, and judge in the Hay trial, was appointed as the new prosecuting counsel, and there was a new jury. The trial lasted 2 days. Cummins gave evidence in his own defense, denying he had ever been to Evelyn Oatley's flat, and claiming that he had been drunk that night but had returned to his billet. He added that the police had intimidated him into making a statement after he had been arrested, and accused Greeno of saying, "We have a rope around your neck." John Flowers, for the defense, cited Laura Denmark, a defense witness, who stated that she had been with Cummins on the night of an alleged murder, and he had been in every way gentlemanly. What could in a few minutes turn him into a homicidal maniac who senselessly killed and frightfully mutilated another woman? On the 28th of April, the jury discussed the verdict for 35 minutes before returning to give the judge their decision: guilty. Asquith remarked that the crime was a sadistic sexual murder of a ghoulish type. However, when asked if he had anything to say, Cummins answered, "I am absolutely innocent." He was sentenced to death. Cheryl later pondered a rhetorical question in his memoirs. You may wonder what manner of man this was who, night after night, set out to murder and mutilate women with such wanton savagery. One is left perplexed and horrified at the vicious cruelty which animated Cummins in his lust to kill. There is little in Cummins' history to provide any clues as to his future activity. He came from a stable lower middle-class background. Cummins had been born in New Earswick, just to the north of York, on the 18th of February, 1914. He had a brother and a sister, and his father was a schoolmaster. He was the first, but not the last, London serial killer to have emerged from Yorkshire. Yet his background provides no clue as to what he would become. His father was headmaster of an approved school for boys. Cummins attended the Landovery Intermediate County School, Barrisbrook, Carmarthenshire. The family moved to Harleston, Northamptonshire, as his father took a new job there. From 1929-35, the family lived in the schoolhouse in Harleston, as his father was headmaster at that school. The family kept themselves to themselves and had few friends. Those who knew Cummins described him as being a daredevil and always in mischief, but nothing of a serious nature. And local Quakers regarded him as an impulsive lad with a streak of fantasy in his makeup. Here Cummins attended Northampton Town and County Secondary School for Boys on the 15th of January 1929 and left in July 1930. He then attended Northampton Technical School. His school record was poor, and at the college he was deemed to be a lazy student, but nevertheless he was awarded a diploma in chemistry. In August 1933, Cummins was employed at Messrs. G. Barker and Company Limited of Northampton, a leather works, but was dismissed in September 1934 because he was seen as being inefficient at his job and unable to grasp the instructions he was given. Leaving the provinces, he went to London. He then worked at a laboratory in Swiss Cottage and at Messrs. Reptile Dressers Limited of Bermondsey Street as an assistant tanner and research assistant. On the 11th of November 1935, he joined the RAF as a flight rigger and in 1942 was trained to be a pilot. His father sent him allowances to supplement his pay. He was stationed at a number of bases during his 6 years of service. Felixstowe from 1936-39, Helensburgh in Scotland from 1939 to February 1941, and Cologne in April 1941. His conduct in the RAF was exemplary. He never complained, was very efficient at his job, and was eager to fly. In October 1941, he was put forward as an aviation candidate and was then stationed at Predenack, Cornwall, as a cadet pilot. From the 1st of February 1942, he lived at a barracks for RAF pilot cadets at 27 St. James Close in the Regent's Park district of North London, sharing a room with a number of others. Cummins was married on the 28th of November 1936 to Marjorie Stevens at Paddington Registry Office in London, but he and his wife had no children, as seems to be the case with several serial killers, including Smith and Christie. Yet in 1942, he said, "Our 6 years of married life have been happy," and she said that he was cultured and well-spoken, certainly not a sex maniac or a pervert. Cummins claimed to his fellows that he had aristocratic connections and cultivated an upper-class accent. He was known as the Count and the Duke, and spoke with a refined diction and acted in a polished manner. At one point he was known as the Honorable George Cummins. He was a poser. Corporal Vickery Brown was impressed. To him, Cummins was a well-spoken young man, appeared to be very well educated. His flight sergeant said Cummins always seemed normal to me and was of a cheerful disposition. It is possible that Cummins may have committed earlier crimes. There were the murders of 2 women in London in 1941, already alluded to. Then there were assaults on women in Bath and Cologne while he was there, but nothing could be proved against him. Cummins was fond of drinking to excess and enjoyed the company of women, as he had already admitted. Greenough wrote that his RAF colleagues deemed him a boastful type of person, very loose morally and having considerable influence over women. Flight Sergeant Ball said that Cummins was always borrowing small sums of money from his colleagues, and as for women, he seemed obsessed with them. The police believed the motive for the murders was robbery. They deemed Cummins a cunning, boastful type of individual. In 1941, he had worked as a barman at the Blue Peter Club in Bath and became friendly with the female owner whose bedroom he had access to. He stole £35 worth of jewelry from her, but was never charged. Greenough wrote he could not carry on his high mode of living without money, resorted to robbery trying to cover up his crimes by murdering and mutilating the bodies of his victims, to suggest the perpetrator was a madman. Cummins certainly wanted a lifestyle in which drink flowed freely, and he could enjoy the favors of women. This required an income he lacked. He had stolen to fund his habits previously, and to kill to acquire more money was an extreme further step, but one he evidently took. Yet to ascribe his murders just to greed is insufficient. The mutilation and contempt he showed his 3 latter victims suggests a far more violent personality and a deep hatred of women, Money may have been his primary aim, but he also spent time attacking their bodies after death, which he could do without interruption as he was indoors. Jack the Ripper had done likewise at Miller's Court, though his mutilations were far more severe than those inflicted by Cummins. Following the verdict, there was an appeal. This was heard on the 8th of June before 3 appeal court judges. They were shown the photographs of the relevant evidence. Dennis Noel Pritt, K.C., was counsel for Cummins, and he argued that the verdict was contrary to the weight of the evidence and that the judge had not given the jury emphatic enough warning over the stories in the press about the case, which he said biased the public against the defendant. Cummins himself smiled at the women at the back of the court. Sir Travers Humphreys was the senior judge present, and he said that the evidence against Cummins had been overwhelming, especially the fingerprint evidence, and that the judge's summing up had been impeccable. The appeal, therefore, was dismissed. Humphreys stated there was no scamping the evidence in this case. Superintendent Cherrell was examined fairly fully in chief. He was fully cross-examined in the most minute detail by the learned counsel who appeared for the accused, and in order to make his points quite clear to the jury, counsel obtained permission from the learned judge to leave his place and go close to the jury box, in order that he might point with a pencil to his copy of the photograph, so that the jury might see what it was he was referring to. 75. After sentencing and the failure of the appeal, Cummins' family wrote to him, and vice versa. They were convinced of his innocence, which he maintained, writing, "I am convinced that there is no justice in this country. I who am completely innocent, and I shouldn't be punished at all." His wife wrote, "We will go on fighting against injustice," and was adamant that nothing can alter my feelings for you, and come what may, I shall always believe that you are innocent. They were convinced that John Flowers badly mishandled the case, and that we were up against the stone wall of unconscious prejudice. The jury was such a collection of dimwits. Cummins and his family thought the fingerprint evidence was wrong, that he was drunk at the time of the murders, claimed there was no blood on his clothes, and that another cadet was guilty. He claimed it was convicted on several so-called facts which are ridiculous. On the other hand, while in Wandsworth Prison, he wrote, "I am treated here with every consideration, enjoying the 15 cigarettes a day, better food than in the RAF, and the facilities of the prison library." There had been discussion of Cummins' mental state, as this might alter his fate. In the RAF, he was deemed quite normal and possessed of his full faculties. In Brixton Prison, before his trial, Dr. Hugh Grierson, the medical officer there, concluded that the accused has been normal in conduct and rational conversation. At no time has he exhibited any evidence of mental disease. Cummins denied any perversion or being sexually deviant. There was a medical examination of Cummins on the 19th of June by Dr. East, former Commissioner of Prisons, and Dr. Hopwood, Superintendent of Broadmoor, to ascertain whether he was sane. If he was not, he would be sent to Broadmoor. The report no longer exists, but presumably it agreed with the earlier reports. Alcohol played a part in these crimes. On all occasions, Cummins had been drinking prior to the murders. Alcohol, in some cases, can reduce moral qualms that might inhibit criminal action, but in itself, it does not cause violence. Alcohol played a part in Donald Hume's murder of Stanley Setti in 1949, and for Field and Gray in the murder of Irene Monroe in 1920, and also for Peter Sutcliffe in his murders in 1975, 1981, to name but a few. We should also note that unlike Jack the Ripper in 1888, Cummins did not go out equipped to kill. He could be termed a disorganized serial killer, in that he used the weapons that were to hand, such as Evelyn Hamilton's scarf, Evelyn Oatley's razor, and the ligatures available in Margaret Lowe's and Doris's rooms. There were also letters petitioning Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary, for clemency. These came from Cummins' father, naturally enough, and also from William Temple, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The People's Common Law Society also petitioned him. Morrison, however, found no grounds on which he could recommend a royal pardon. Cummins was executed at Wandsworth Prison, like Cream and Chapman, on the 25th of June, 1942, during an air raid. Greenough later wrote, "I shed no tears for Cummins." Cummins was likened to Jack the Ripper, and noted as being the worst killer since him. He had mostly preyed on prostitutes and had mutilated them after killing them. For instance, the People stated, as did many other newspapers, that he was the most notorious killer since Jack the Ripper. The term Blackout Ripper was not immediately used to refer to Cummins, but it was in use by 1954, when Cheryl titled his chapter about Cummins' crimes in his memoirs. Yet the police also noted, "This interesting but sordid series of murders has no parallels, so far as can be ascertained, in the history of the Metropolitan Police." However, there was one crucial difference. Cummins made serious blunders in leaving his fingerprints all over 2 of the scenes of his murders, and to cap it all, left his gas mask behind during his attack on Margaret Haywood. With clues like these, the detectives were able to track him down with relative speed, and so bring his crimes to an end. The speed with which Cummins worked 4 murders in 4 days may also have proved his undoing, as he showed extreme carelessness and arrogance.